All right, so buckle up because we're diving into some seriously philosophical waters today.
Deep end of the pool this time.
You said it. You sent us some excerpts from Michel Serres Habiter, and let me tell you, this is going to get complex.
Yeah, Serres, he really wants to unpack this idea of inhabiting, but not just in the sense of like living in a house or apartment.
Right, not just bricks and mortar.
He wants us to think about it as a verb, as an action. How do we inhabit time, our bodies? How do we inhabit ideas even?
So it's less about where you hang your hat and more about how you experience any given space. Almost like how you exist within it, yeah.
Exactly. And he goes to some really interesting places with this. Like one of the first things he talks about is the womb, our first dwelling.
Okay, going way
Our
beyond.
primal habitat. It's where it all begins, right? This idea of being enveloped, safe. It shapes how we interact with the world from the very beginning.
So it's like, even on a subconscious level, that feeling of being held, being contained, it influences our understanding of what it means to be somewhere.
Right. And he actually links the words habitation and habits, suggesting that that initial experience of containment, of having boundaries, it stays with us. It influences how we relate to every environment and experience we encounter afterwards.
Wow. So our housing starts even before we're born, in a way. That's wild.
And speaking of how our physical forms, play into all this, he also has some really interesting thoughts about the male and female forms.
Oh yeah, he gets pretty metaphorical with this one.
He compares a female body to a doris, which, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is like a nimble fishing boat designed to navigate rough seas.
You got it built for those choppy waters.
Whereas he sees the male body as more like a sturdy barge, something that's built for calmer waters.
A very different kind of vessel. And I think what he's getting at there is this inherent dynamism and resilience of the female form, built to weather change, to navigate the ever-shifting tides of existence. It's a really interesting way of looking at it, even if it might seem a bit,
provocative.
That's a good way to put it. But it makes you think, right? Because our physical experience of the world, it does shape how we interact with it. And he even takes those comparisons further by talking about how, our human constructions mirror nature in a lot of ways.
Totally. That whole nature versus culture thing, he kind of flips it on its head.
He says cities are like forests of upright trees. Our movements are echoes of animals. It's like we're constantly mirroring nature, even in these man-made jungles that we've created. What do you call it?
He says, every construction, every man-made element of our world is simply an expression of our physical experience with nature.
Which, okay, that's a really interesting way to look at it. And it makes me think about his whole take on cities versus the countryside, because he seems to have this love-hate relationship with both, right?
Totally. Cities with their grid-like streets and that relentless pursuit of progress, they represent order and history to him.
The very essence of time, always moving forward, always structured.
Right, like a perfectly synchronized clock just ticking away.
And then there's the countryside, which is, anything but a synchronized clock. That's where the unpredictable rhythms of, weather dictate how life unfolds.
The countryside, he says, is like a patchwork of unique locations, as opposed to, the uniform grid of the city. It's a tapestry woven by nature's whims, not carefully plotted out.
Right. You can't control for the weather. But he doesn't romanticize rural life either. He talks about this historical warfare between the city and the countryside, with the city constantly trying to impose its values, its systems on the rural world.
It's like this constant tension between control and chaos, I guess.
Yeah.
The city, in its pursuit of, efficiency, often disregards the innate rhythms, even the wisdom of the natural world. It's a dynamic that shaped human history for millennia and frankly continues to do so.
And then just when you think you're starting to wrap your head around it all, enter technology. Trains, the internet, globalization, all of it changing our sense of habiter yet again.
Yeah, he uses train stations as a really interesting example here, this symbol of shrinking space and accelerated time.
Because it's a transition point, right? You're in one place, then suddenly you're being hurtled towards another, and your connection to any given location becomes very fleeting. Temporary.
Yeah. It's almost this in-between space. You're neither here nor there. And this was all, of course, before the internet, social media, all of that. But
it's like he predicted it. The hyper-connected world we live in now, where we're constantly bombarded with information and our sense of place, of belonging, it becomes increasingly fragmented. So are we even capable of truly inhabiting any space in this modern world? Or has technology just made us all digital nomads, even if we never leave our homes?
That's a question I think Serres really grapples with, particularly in some of his later writings on space exploration. But before we get there, I think it's important to explore how Serres connects this, like, physical inhabiting to the idea of belonging in a community.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, like, the physical structures anymore. Now we're bringing those human connections into it, too.
Exactly. Because think about it. He talks about how, like, the anonymity of cities, the transience, those very things that represent progress, that forward momentum, it can actually lead to a sense of isolation.
You know, it's funny because you can be surrounded by people, you can pass a million faces on the street every day and still feel totally, like, invisible.
Alone in a crowd, yeah.
Right. He contrasts that with the countryside, where people tend to put down roots, both literally and figuratively, building those connections through shared experience, that sense of place, that slower pace of life.
But didn't he also say that Serres doesn't, like, romanticize the countryside?
Yep.
That there's a flip side to that coin as well.
Oh, absolutely. He acknowledges that, while tight-knit communities can offer this incredible sense of belonging, there can also be drawbacks. Conformity, social pressure, you're kind of locked into those rhythms and traditions, whether you like it or not sometimes. Right, right. It's like any habitat, there are always going to be like advantages and disadvantages. Cities might be isolating, but the countryside can be stifling. And it feels like, and maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but it's almost like he's pointing to this kind of duality in human nature itself. Like, we have this drive to create, to build, to connect, but we also have this capacity for destruction and control at the same time.
Totally. In fact, he even has a term for that, the netocracy. This idea that, power structures, especially those tied to urban environments, are often built on this foundation of, like, controlling nature, even to the point of destruction.
Which is, that's a bit of a sobering thought when you think about how much of our world, our modern world, is built around these urban centers.
So is he saying we should, like, abandon cities altogether, go full, like, Walden Pond on it?
Well, I don't think it's quite as simple as, choosing one or the other. Remember his example of his grandmother? He talks about her a lot, this peasant woman. He says she understood how to navigate all sorts of spaces. She wove them together, almost seamlessly. Right, like how she moved between her home, her garden, even the act of, like, knitting. It was all connected somehow.
And that's what he seems to admire so much about her, that intuitive grasp of what it means to habiter. She wasn't just occupying space. She was actively shaping and creating, connecting the past, present, future through every action. He actually compares her knitting to, get this, Homer writing the Odyssey.
Wait, hold up. Knitting and epic poetry. How on earth does that work? Seriously, knitting and epic poetry. Those two things seem, I don't know, kind of worlds apart. How does he even connect those two things?
It's all about the weaving. Think about it, both knitting and epic poetry involve this intricate threading together of space and time, connecting all these seemingly disparate elements to create something whole and new.
Okay, I'm starting to see it now. So his grandmother, with her, her needles and yarn, through those rhythmic motions of her hands, she's creating something tangible, something useful, right?
Exactly. And Homer, through his words, through his stories, he was weaving together myths, history, cultural values even, all of that coming together in this timeless story that's still being told today.
It makes you think about all the ways we weave our own narratives, even now, even in the digital age.
Which actually brings us back to something we were discussing earlier, how technology impacts our sense of inhabiting. And this is where, believe it or not, Sarah's thoughts on space exploration come into play.
Okay, this is what I love about Serres. You never know where he's going to take you next.
Right, so we were talking about train stations before as representing that shrinking of space and the acceleration of time.
Yeah, those in-between spaces, those transition points where you're neither here nor there, kind of like being, online.
Exactly. And he uses space travel as another example, this time to illustrate the limitations of technology. Like, we can send probes to Mars, right?
Yeah.
We can explore its surface remotely, but there's no substitute for actually being there.
So he's saying we shouldn't confuse information with experience. Like actually standing on Martian soil, breathing that thin air, that would hit us on a whole other level, right?
Exactly. And he brings that same logic back to our online lives.
Yeah.
We can inhabit all these virtual spaces, but we can't forget that we are still grounded in these bodies, experiencing the world through our senses.
So it's like, even though technology has given us all these new ways to connect, to explore, to expand our reach, those physical, those sensory experiences, those are still fundamentally, like, human.
He even asked this very pointed question: what can we not do without the body? And I think it's a question worth sitting with for a minute.
It really is. So where does that leave us if we're constantly being pulled between these, physical and virtual spaces? How do we find that balance?
Honestly, I don't think Serres gives us like a hard and fast answer to that question. He's more about giving us a framework to think about it. He wants us to be more conscious inhabitants of every space we occupy, whether it's physical or virtual.
So more than just existing in a space, it's about actively, consciously inhabiting it, shaping it, making it our own.
Yes, but not in, a domineering way,
Yeah.
but in a way that recognizes that we're all connected, that our actions have an impact, for better or worse.
That's a pretty great note to end on, I'd say. It really makes you think.
It does.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the mind-bending world of Michel Serres.
Always a wild ride.
As always, big thanks to everyone for listening in, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.